Hello and welcome to Social Value UK's webinar on the first 4 impact questions, those that are primarily qualitative in nature. The objectives and purpose of this webinar are to really delve into those first 4 impact questions and highlight the central importance as to how qualitative engagement can help create an effective theory of change focused very much on well-defined outcomes, and how this information can help us start to make decisions about the materiality of different outcomes. That is a term that will be further introduced and discussed as this webinar progresses. Just as a little bit of background and reminder about Social Value UK and our mission, we are part of Social Value International, an internationally registered charity that is the representative of over 20 national networks who all share a mission and passion to change the way the world accounts for value. By taking account of the financial, environmental and social outcomes of activities, we believe that we can make decisions that reduce inequality, improve the environmental harm and reducing the environmental harm that is created through our decisions, and improving the well-being of people. To do that, we really need to understand what social value is. So as a brief reminder, we're talking about changes that people experience, or if we're talking about a prospective forecast analysis, those changes that people are likely to experience in their lives. These are commonly referred to as outcomes of activities. People experience different changes, and these are likely to be valued differently by those people. It's really important that we understand how important different changes are in relation to one another. This is where we start to talk about the relative importance, understanding that one outcome is more or less important than another outcome. In fact, going a little bit further, not just that it is more or less important, but how much more or less important. This is what we refer to by meaning the relative importance of these different changes. Doing so allows us to really understand where we can create most value and really help us to start to allocate resources to create the most value with the resources that we have. If we value things using the language of money, using financial proxies, we're able to undertake a social return on investment, SROI, where the value of those changes experienced by different stakeholders can be compared to the value of the inputs, the financial and non-financial resources required. And that produces a ratio, a social return on investment, that tells us for each £1, €1, £1 yen, $1 invested, the social return on investment is X. Fundamental, before we get into the how to measure and starting to look at those impact questions, it's really important that we understand why we're doing this. All organisations create impacts. We need to be able to measure those impacts, but that is simply not enough. We need to go further. We need to start doing or using information to help us do what we're already doing more effectively, which is managing our impacts, increasing the positive changes that people experience, and reducing, and if not eliminating, some of those negative changes that people experience through our activities. If we have a philosophy of doing this all the time, of impact thinking, we can start to have this idea of maximizing. It may be more appropriate to talk about optimizing, but essentially what we're talking about is using the resources we have at hand to create as much impact as possible, and doing this all of the time, relentlessly driving innovation, relentlessly driving for opportunities and insight that help us to create more impact. So that's the why we do that. Start to moving into the issues around how we do so. The principles of social value, the 7 principles, underpin everything that Social Value International do. And central to those principles are the involvement of stakeholders. When we refer to stakeholders, we mean any individual or group of individuals that can affect or be affected by activities. It's those stakeholders that help us get a better understanding of the holistic impacts of our activities, where stakeholders start to tell us what has changed. These are the outcomes of our activities. Those stakeholders also value the changes, helping us to understand the central importance of those different changes. We'll talk about materiality as we go through this webinar. We'll also, in the next webinar, where we start to deal with some of the quantitative questions, deal more with the principle around avoiding overclaiming. And the principles around transparency and verifying the result are really intended to ensure that any reporting of results are truthful, honest and accurate, and are able to serve the purpose to which they attend. Overlaying all of these principles, it in an implicit nature, is the need for us to be responsive. And this is essentially saying, well, we've got some information, we have some new insight, what are we going to do with it? How will we respond? What will we do to increase positive experiences of people? And what will we do to reduce any negative experiences? that people unintentionally experience through our activities. There is further information available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites on the principles of social value. As I say, these do underpin all of the work we do and must be applied to all analyses in a proportionate manner. In a more operational sense, the impact questions really do help us understand in a certain amount of detail those particular questions that we need to ask to be able to account for our social value. And by accounting for social value, again, we mean the ability to, yes, measure what we're doing, but also manage and ultimately aim to maximise the impacts of our activities. Today, we're going to go into the first 4 questions in more detail around the problem and solutions, but also starting to look at those questions around who experiences changes, who are those stakeholders, and what are the outcomes that they have or are likely to experience. A further webinar will deal with the more quantitative elements of the impact questions, where we start to look at the significance of them. In addition, this webinar will also deal with a final question, or we will certainly introduce the final question that says which changes matter to the people who have been affected. We will start to deal with that question in this webinar also. Overlaying these important impact questions are some additional meta questions, if you like. And the first one is, who answers the questions? To whom do we direct these questions? The answer to most of the questions when we ask around social value is stakeholders. It's the people with lived experience, or those likely to have lived experience, who will be able to tell us what has changed, will be able to inform us as to the value of those changes, and so on. The phrase that we hope sticks in the mind is this idea of enough precision for the decision. What this is saying is that we need data that is rigorous enough, that is accurate enough, that is relevant enough to inform the decision that we seek to influence, ensuring that the evidence is fit for purpose, that it provides us with enough precision to influence the decision, certainly not too little precision, but also not too much. If we're gaining more and more precision, more and more rigor, there will be resource requirements. If this is not necessary to support the decision in hand, then it is a waste of resource. To put that into context, imagine the difference in scenario where we're trying to potentially influence government policy. The level of rigor and accuracy and precision we require will be very, very high. If alternatively, we're looking to make a smaller, less impactful decision within an organisation, we still need a certain level of precision to support that decision, but it is certainly not the same as would be required for a government policy level decision. Moving into these impact questions, we're going to deal initially with the first 2, where we start to ask the question around the problem or issue we're trying to address and the proposed solution to those problems. This is following a reasonably consistent, or certainly reasonably familiar cycle, where we're going through the plan, do, review and revise. Today, we will focus within this webinar around planning. So questions 1 and 2, the problem and solution. It's essential that we start to think about this, and I'm sure all organisations do so. But what we're trying to say is, are we doing so explicitly enough? Are we embedding those principles of social value into how we address the problem and solution? If we're not thinking carefully about the problem, there is a real risk that we may not make any difference. In fact, there is also the risk that we create negative impact in the lives of people. We need to move to a position where we can identify a specific impact goal or impact goals, the part of the bigger problem that we are able and aiming to address. To do so, we need to start to think about the real root causes of the problems, and there will be multiple root causes to any problems. Being able to identify the various root problems allows us as an organisation to identify where we and our activities can start to address the problems. It can also help us identify where other entities, be they individuals or organisations, can also contribute. A particularly helpful analogy when thinking about identifying those root causes of problems is the problem tree. We can see from the problem tree that there's a central problem. This is the trunk. The root causes, unsurprisingly enough, are the roots, and the branches show the different effects of the trunk-based problem. If we can start, as we've said, to identify the root causes of problems, we can start to define and refine effective solutions. And again, bearing in mind principle number 1 to involve stakeholders. If stakeholders are involved, even at design stage of a service, they can help us design more effective solutions, solutions that really do address the root causes, the needs that they have. Let's put that into practice. Let's use a case study example. We're going to see this example throughout the webinar, and in the next webinar, where we focus on the quantitative questions, this of employability. It's a social enterprise based in the UK that supports long-term unemployed people, providing them with the practical and pastoral skills they need to find work. It's a voluntary programme that supports people for 12 months, again to create the necessary skills, also provide them with those practical outputs around CVs and so forth. So the problem is, the central trunk to the problem is high youth unemployment. Employability initiated because of it. Let's put this idea into practice using a case study. This case study, referred to as employability, has identified a central problem that there is long-term unemployment among young people. Employability is a social enterprise designed to help long-term unemployed people gain the skills they need to find work. It's a voluntary program that also supports them to create the practical outputs they require, such as CVs, and also giving them things such as interview practice. So a reasonably familiar social enterprise to many of the activities that people undertake. Here's employability's problem tree. So the central trunk, the central problem, is that there is high youth unemployment. There are numerous effects of this problem, and we can see above the... So here we have employability's problem tree. And we can see that the central problem, the trunk, is that there is high youth unemployment. There are numerous effects from this central trunk problem. These are the branches and the leaves. And this is issues around a loss of talent and skills, reduced economic growth, mental health concerns, a lack of motivation, and higher risk of poverty. So what are some of the root causes of this problem, this central problem around high youth unemployment? Those boxes in yellow highlight a range of root causes. There will, of course, be more. We can see on the far left-hand side that there are young people lacking in confidence. People are leaving education without the right skills. There are also negative effects from family and friends. I hope you can see that those are probably the key areas where employability can really start to have an effect. Again, thinking back to employability's activities around the provision of skills and training for long-term unemployed people. But there are other root causes. We can see that there's a lack of investment in the city, that there's a changing job market. These are root causes that definitely have an impact and effect on the systemic problem of high youth unemployment, but they are beyond the means and the remit of employability. That is not to say, however, that these root causes do not need addressing, and it may be that employability, with this insight alone, could start to ask itself questions about, well, should it diversify its activities? Should it partner with other institutions? Perhaps it should start to campaign around some of these other issues. This is not to say, of course, that employability should try and address all of the root causes, but it really does allow the organisation to identify where it can have an impact, but also those other factors, those other root causes that also need to be addressed if there is the intention to create systemic and sustained change. So we've identified those root causes that employability can really start to address. It can help them to identify and refine their impact goal. So this large trunk-based problem, again, is high youth unemployment. Now, employability could come up with a number of impact goals. The one we've suggested here is that they support 18 to 25-year-olds from a particular geographic region to secure and maintain employment. Now, that impact goal could, of course, be even more specific and talk about providing people with the necessary skills and confidence in order to access the job market. We could, even at this stage, start to introduce target setting. We discussed in the previous webinar the central importance of targets, helping an organisation to hold itself to account, being able to ultimately manage and move towards a philosophy of maximising impacts. As well as identifying the impact goal of supporting a certain age group from a certain geographical region to secure employment, there could have been more refined focus. We could have also identified a target for the number of people to secure employment, as well as thinking about the quality of that employment, perhaps around issues around the level of salary and the level of satisfaction with the jobs that people secure. With this information, we can start to create a theory of change. Theory of change works backwards from that impact goal. We'll follow that scenario through for employability. We then want to work backwards and start to think about some of those outcomes, those changes that people need to experience for that impact goal to be realised. So we're going backwards from impact goal to outcomes. We then take a further step backwards and start to talk about outputs. Outputs are the activities summarised in numbers, and those help us to create the outcomes, those changes that people experience in their lives. Taking a further step backwards, we can start to think about the activities, the different services that an organisation delivers in order for the outcomes to be realised. We need to identify those causal links between activities and outcomes. Also thinking about those inputs, the financial and non-financial resources required from the different stakeholders in order to create those sustained changes. It's also really important that we explicitly state any assumptions and other external factors that underpin and could affect those causal links between our activities, outputs, outcomes, and ultimately the impact goal. As a visual representation, the theory of change looks a little bit like this. Again, going backwards from the impact goal, start to think about those outcomes, outputs, activities, and inputs. This is a very simplified view. It's very, very unlikely that we would have a single line of causal effects going from inputs through to impact goal. This is just a visualization of the theory of change. So how do we create an effective theory of change? Well, again, principle number 1, to involve stakeholders, can help us to refine our approach and also make us think about a more holistic view of outcomes. Thinking about involving stakeholders, again, even at the design stage, design of goods or services, can help us provide and refine more effective solutions. We should also explore existing research. Perhaps there's some research out there that can help us defend and strengthen our assumptions about those causal links between different activities and their respective outcomes. All of this can help provide further insights that can help us refine our solution. Let's put the theory of change into practice for employability. So employability has an overall impact goal to create sustained employment opportunities for 18 to 25-year-old people living in a particular part in the northwest of the UK. So some of their specific goals around this is clearly that young people secure employment, but that also young people are able to make more informed decisions about their future. So what needs to change for people for those goals to be realised? Again, changes, we're starting to talk about outcomes. This visualisation shows 2 levels of outcomes, if you like. So on the far right-hand side, we have that young people are applying for more jobs or further training, that young people's confidence has increased. We're talking about confidence about their own future, and also that young people feel more supported and more prepared for work. Taking a step further back, these are still outcomes, but these are, if you like, more intermediate outcomes, different steps, one outcome leading to another, and so forth. And you can see on the left-hand side, outcomes changes around people feeling a greater level of understanding, that people have learned new skills, and that people have an increased support network. So we've gone back from our impact goal, we have some goals for the organisation and the changes that we need people to experience in order for that impact goal to be realised. We can take a step further backwards and talk about those outputs and the activities. And those 2 things often go hand in hand because the outputs are the quantitative summary of our activity in numbers. So we provide employability programs, they provide mentoring support for 12 months. The outputs of those activities are essentially around the number of people provided with support and the number of support sessions, the number of mentoring sessions, and so on. This theory of change would, of course, be extended even further back, and it would talk about the inputs, those necessary financial and non-financial resources. But again, as a visualization of a theory of change, this is quite a simplified view. It only takes account of one stakeholder group, the young people. Hopefully, we could also start to think about other stakeholders that may be influenced by this activity, but also could influence this activity. So thinking about the employers, thinking about family members of these young people, and so on and so forth. We need to start thinking, even at this stage, about some target setting and some numbers. Inputs, we would start to think about some of the financial resources. The outputs, how many training sessions, how many young people do we expect to train over a period of 12 months? And what are some of those numbers around the outcomes? Not just the number of people that change, but also thinking about the extent of change, the amount of change or the delta of change. Again, with target setting, we're not just saying we want X amount of people to change. We should be thinking about we want X amount of people to change by a certain degree. We'll go into that in more detail when we deal with the second webinar on the impact questions, where we have a bit of a deeper dive into some of those quantitative dimensions. But even at this stage, we should be thinking about target setting. That will help us as an organisation hold ourselves to account. And by that we mean identifying opportunities to increase the impacts that we create. No longer asking the question of what impact has been created, but turning the question into something more along the lines of, have we created as much impact as we can with the resources we have at hand? We can only address that question if we have a target, an expectation. So there are some real advantages in terms of creating a theory of change. It can create a very effective framework, helping us identify what we will need to measure going forwards. It provides a fantastic opportunity to involve stakeholders, even at the design stage, which I think is often something overlooked by organisations. It can help us refine our focus on those particular root problems, those particular causes of problems that our organisation can effectively address. And as mentioned, it can help us to start setting targets that can help us drive our accountability and drive the impact that we create. The visualizations presented in this webinar are very, very simplistic, overly simplistic. And this is often a criticism levelled at theories of change created by organisations. They often don't involve stakeholders. If we're not involving stakeholders, we are more likely to miss insights. It's very unlikely that we will think about or that we are conscious of those unintended negative changes that people may experience. The old adage of what gets measured gets managed. If we're not creating a system where we can effectively measure the positive and negative changes, we miss an opportunity to mitigate, if not eliminate, those negatives. So we need to try and move to a position where the theory of change is not overly theoretical, where it is informed by stakeholders. It is informed by evidence that exists. So those causal links, they are defended, they are justified. Those judgments made are justified based on stakeholder involvement and existing evidence. Moving to a position where our theory of change is a more effective representation of the reality. And we talk about impact questions, and there are 10 impact questions. Each time we address one or more of those impact questions, we should really ask ourselves if we have enough insight to make a decision, to change the way we are doing something. So we ask this question after every impact question. Could we make a decision now? So if we think about the reality where we've had a stakeholder-informed theory of change, and we've been informed about some of those unintended negative changes, it may be, even at this stage, that we say we now have enough information to change our approach, to consider changing how we deliver our solution, our activities, to create more positive impact. It may be that we say we need more confidence, we need more evidence. If that be the case, then we can go into the next impact questions. So we're really moving into some of the data collection now, and we're going to address impact questions 3 and then 4. So initially, we're going to focus on this question around who experiences change in their lives. So when we're talking about stakeholders in this respect, it's very much those that can be affected by activities. As referred to, stakeholders for Social Value International means any individual or group of individuals that are affected or can be affected. So we're not only focusing on those stakeholders that are the primary target audience of our activities, we would think about those that have those unintended changes in their lives as well. So why would we involve stakeholders? Well, it can provide absolutely rich, fantastic information that can help inform how we deliver our services. It's good practice. It can help us create effective relationships with those we work with and those that we support. Just thinking about our stakeholders, we may identify a group that have wholly negative experiences. It may be, again, that provides us with enough evidence that we want to change how we deliver our services to mitigate for those negative changes experienced by people. It can also help us identify new opportunities for partnerships. Perhaps we find out through one stakeholder or a group of stakeholders that they're also interacting with another organisation, or that other organisation could be a potential partner for future delivery. There are some real risks of not asking this question, and they're usually the opposite of the benefits, in that we are unable to understand our impacts. We miss significant opportunities to increase or even maximise our impact. The standard on applying Principle 1 involves stakeholders is freely available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites. Please do have a look at this for some more information. Some questions we need to ask when we're accounting for our social impacts, when we're managing our social impacts. And the big question is, which of those stakeholders that we affect are going to be included when we measure the impacts of our activities? As the question states, will we include everyone? What are the potential risks of not involving or including a stakeholder group in our assessment? And then the practicalities of, well, what resources are required to involve our stakeholders? We need to take a systematic approach to this when we start to think about stakeholder involvement. And one recommendation is to create a stakeholder engagement plan. The plan would identify the range of different stakeholders. It would allow us to identify when they will be engaged, how frequently, the deadlines for doing so, and by whom. Ideally, we would engage all stakeholders. We would involve all stakeholders to understand the different material changes that they experience. But the reality is that we may need to do so incrementally. Perhaps in year one, we start with one group of stakeholders, but we have a plan in place where we have a firm commitment from the organisation to roll out our engagement process to include more and more stakeholders over time. In doing so, we reduce the risks of missing important material information that will help us make better decisions. As the final point says as well, we also need to think about segmenting our stakeholders and also thinking if there are any individuals or groups of individuals that have been displaced by our activities. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail now. When we talk about segmenting stakeholders, we're really trying to identify subgroups or clusters of people that are identified by shared characteristics. But those shared characteristics are not necessarily shared by, say, segment A and segment B. So we may have a client group. In the case of employability, we have young people. Thinking about some of the characteristics that could help us segment those young people. It could be issues around their sex, their age, where they live, the level of family support they have, their educational status, perhaps. There's a whole raft of potential characteristics that could help us better understand why people have different experiences. These are the different segments. The purpose of understanding this is so that we can tailor and target our services, our solutions accordingly. Perhaps we find out that segment A have different experiences to segment B, and therefore we can ask the question of, well, what can we do differently to make sure that we are maximising the impact for those different segments? I hope people listening to this are thinking, well, we do this. We do much of this implicitly, if not explicitly. And that's often what we find to be the case. We will treat people differently, and we will treat them differently based on their characteristics. We know that some people may react more to sort of positive encouragement, and others perhaps need a bit more of the stick, if you like. What we are saying here is, what are the characteristics that can help us better understand people so that we can better provide services that increase impacts for all, making some of those decisions or improving our ability to make those decisions. We also need to think about if we're displacing outcomes or displacing people. This is where we simply move a problem from one area to another, the leaf blower being a fantastic example as such, just moving a problem, not addressing it as such. Or perhaps through our activities, a group of stakeholders are only experiencing negative outcomes. Perhaps by employing or stimulating the employment of young people in Merseyside, does that mean that other people are displaced, i.e. they are prevented or restricted from finding work? Displacement is particularly acute when we think about issues around employment, but also issues around reducing crime. Perhaps we reduce crime in one area. Does that solve the problem, or does it simply displace it to another area? So we start to think about our stakeholders, but we're starting to refine what we're thinking about them. Are there any that were displaced? Within those different stakeholders as well, are there characteristics that can help us segment? All of these points, all of these impact questions are again designed to give us further insight that can help us make a better decision. Having just asked this one question, or this next question, perhaps we now understand that there is a group of stakeholders who are displaced, i.e. they're experiencing negative outcomes as a result of our activities. Maybe this information alone provides sufficient confidence for us to change our services, to change our solution. Perhaps again we find out that segment A and segment B have different experiences. We're starting to think about how we can tailor and target our services accordingly. This is insight. Perhaps we may still want some more information, some more evidence that gives us greater confidence to be able to make that decision. It very much depends on the decision at hand, remembering the phrase, enough precision for the decision. So before we move into impact question 4, where we start to think about outcomes, just as a brief summary, stakeholders, those individuals and groups of individuals, absolutely essential to involve them for us to be able to genuinely understand the outcomes and the impacts of our activities. But we need to go a little bit further than just talking about stakeholder groups. We need to start thinking about the different segments and also if any are displaced by our activities, because again, all of this provides us with real potential and real insight to be able to make better decisions. So moving into impact question 4, this is the question that asks, what are the outcomes experienced? So again, this is pitched as a retrospective question, but of course we could ask as a forecast, just change the tense of the question and say, what are the outcomes that are likely to be experienced? Outcomes really do address that so what question. And what we mean by that is, so what has changed? So what is different as a result of activities? This is going beyond outputs. Outputs, again, is this summary of activities in numbers, but just counting, measuring our activities in numbers, be it the number of training sessions, be it the number of mentoring packages provided, does not tell us about the success or failure of an activity. We can only do that when we start to talk about outcomes. If we don't do so, we have no idea as to whether we are making a positive, negative impact. So Social Value International, we talk about well-defined outcomes. It's fundamental to say that one outcome leads to another, and so on and so forth. To be able to maximize impact, the outcomes that we need to focus on are those that, again, we refer to as well-defined. Well-defined outcomes are reasonably sustainable. What we mean by that is that the risk of the stakeholder returning to their previous situation is reduced by focusing on the outcome, the well-defined outcome in hand. If we think about that with a particular example, perhaps it's that we have somebody who has been drinking alcohol excessively. They've joined a voluntary program in order to reduce their alcohol consumption. Well, reducing alcohol consumption is an outcome, but that is not not necessarily a very sustainable outcome. If we only measure if somebody's reducing alcohol consumption, there's a real risk that very shortly after the program, they could revert back to previous behaviors. Taking it a bit further and asking another so what question, so what's changed as a result of reducing alcohol consumption, will give us greater insight. So stakeholders may talk to us about things such as improved family relationships, improved health, and so on. Those changes are likely to be more sustainable than simply whether somebody has reduced their alcohol consumption or not. It also gives us a really good indication as to what the stakeholder identifies as valuable. So in the situation of reducing alcohol consumption, yes, of course, somebody on a voluntary program wants to reduce their consumption of alcohol. But that's not really why they're motivated to go on the program. It will be something else. Reducing alcohol consumption is a means to an end. So these are the changes that the stakeholder identifies as being valuable to them. These are the changes that really allow us to maximize our impact. And we'll provide an example very shortly based on employability. We also need to think about being complete. So again, this is going beyond just thinking about the goals of activities, which will be explicitly positive, to think about a more holistic view of changes, the intended, unintended, positive, and negative, but also thinking about how different segments of stakeholders have different experiences. This approach lends itself to qualitative research or qualitative engagement. There is a risk if we were to go straight into using a quantitative approach, such as a questionnaire perhaps, that we will miss really important information. If we provide people with a questionnaire that asks if they've experienced outcomes A, B, and C, well, perhaps we've missed outcomes D, E, and F. That can only really come through engagement with stakeholders in a qualitative process, where we ask questions in an open manner, giving people the time and space to inform us as to what has changed. So principle number 1, involving stakeholders, in order to address principle number 2, understand what changes. Again, that holistic view of changes, those outcomes. We can also look at existing research. We can also look at the organisational goals of our activities. We can include those outcomes for further measurement. We refer to social value and SROI as being stakeholder informed rather than stakeholder led. To that end as well, we can also include societal norms. Perhaps our stakeholder doesn't tell us about something because perhaps they're just unaware of it, but it's something that's important to our organisation and or society as well. But qualitative engagement is central to being able to have a greater understanding of the effects, the consequences, the outcomes of our activities. There's a series of questions, and again, there's a standard open source available on the Social Value UK and Social Value International websites. But essentially, we're asking open questions with some probing and some further delving into some of these issues. Again, the so what questions. So what's changed after you left us? What else happened? What changes were you hoping for? Explicitly asking if there were any negative changes, but also asking if other people were affected. So the language is consistently around changes and effects, but we are explicitly asking these in an open manner that allows people to freely open up to us and provide us with some really rich, really effective information. And qualitative data can and is messy quite often. We get lots of words, lots of observations, but this is very, very rich data. Essentially what we're looking for are consistent themes. We're looking for the consistent effects, those changes that people speak about. And this again can help us really refine our segmentation. Perhaps we've previously thought that age would be an issue in terms of people finding work. But perhaps through our engagement, we find out that it was another factor, another characteristic. Perhaps instead of age, it's the level of family support that people have in their lives. Or perhaps it's both of those characteristics working together. As it says, qualitative data can be messy and it can be time consuming. This is potentially the most resource intensive element of social impact assessment, be it one-to-one conversations or group conversations, focus groups and so on. But again, giving people the time and space can give us a far more effective picture of the activities and the consequences of our activities. Let's put this into practice with employability. So we're thinking about today we're only looking at the stakeholder, the person receiving support, so the young person. The activities, they are provided with training and support. There's an output from that, the summary of activity in numbers, and it's the number of training sessions attended. Now we could quite easily put a number on that. Perhaps it's 50 people supported with 10 on average sessions per person. Again, that's so what question. We're starting to ask about outcomes. So the first outcome we may hear from people, and again, this is a simplified visualization, is that some people gain a job. Now, this may be where the funder, our investor perhaps, this is the issue that they are most concerned with, and this is all they ask from us in terms of our reporting as an enterprise. However, let's remind ourselves of those points around what a well-defined outcome is. Something that's reasonably sustainable. We could argue that having a job is reasonably sustainable, of course, but it's also something that the stakeholder would say is valuable. Now, of course, again, a voluntary program, people do want to find, secure and maintain work. But I think if you were to ask people what they really value, they would talk about wanting something more than a job. They would talk about wanting a good job, a satisfactory job, a job that pays a certain amount of money, that has certain working conditions, perhaps is suitable to their living arrangements, where they can perhaps look after their children or older relatives. So we talk about that being a job that people are satisfied with. And again, in the subsequent webinar where we talk about the quantitative impact questions, we can start to really measure what we mean by a satisfactory job. We'll come to that in the next webinar. Now, of course, that chain of outcomes could continue beyond, and perhaps stakeholders would talk to us as saying, well, the thing I really value is the improved relationship with family and friends, perhaps. For this visualization today, we're going to stop at this position and say that this is what the stakeholder has identified as being of value to them. Now, of course, the visualization there talks about some people gaining a job and some of those people getting a job they are satisfied with. Now, that indicates that some people do not get a job. Now, if people voluntarily come on a program where they want to succeed, in this case getting a job they're satisfied with, and that does not happen, that does not materialize, then it is a reasonable assumption to say that people will be depressed. But of course, we would get this information by involving stakeholders. So those that did not get a job are asking, so what changed? So how do you feel? And a representative group of those stakeholders have informed us that they did not get a job, and as a result of that, are more depressed. Are we accountable for those negative changes? I hope that everybody listening to this webinar is saying yes. We are accountable for that because it's a result of our activities. It's not intended, of course. It's not our goal to make people more depressed. Our goal is to get people into jobs, hopefully to get people into jobs they are satisfied with. But that negative change provides us with an opportunity. It provides us with insight. We can look at that, and again, if we can start to understand why some people gain a job and some do not, what are the characteristics that help explain why some people are more successful than others? Let's say, for example, we find out that those people who do not get a job and therefore become more depressed have a poorer support network. Their family support network, their friendships are not as strong perhaps as those who do succeed in finding work. That's the gold dust of stakeholder segmentation. We now understand that a particular characteristic, in this case around support networks, is one of the leading factors in whether people secure employment or not. We can now do something about this. We can now mitigate for this. We can start to ask questions to the organisation and say, well, what can we do differently to support people with the poorer support network more effectively than we have been doing in the past? Because if we don't, we will continue to support people who will leave our organisation and become more depressed. So the decisions that we can take to improve the impacts that we create could be around perhaps peer mentoring. It could perhaps be around managing expectations at the very least, informing people of a certain characteristic that they are less likely to succeed and may need to work harder than some of their counterparts. Perhaps it will help us make an ultimately brave decision in some circumstances to no longer offer support to people of certain characteristics. Many people will say it's immoral to refuse to support certain people. However, if you think about the perspective where if you knowingly allow people onto a program where they are very, very likely to become depressed as a result, I think that is the greater question about morality. However, this is all about accountability and insight. When we understand why segment A are different to segment B, it allows us to tailor our services to be more effective, to do things differently, to support people in a more effective manner. So if people are still thinking that, well, we are not accountable for the negative change, the question we would ask, of course, is, well, how do you know you're accountable for the positive change? Again, the quantitative dimensions will give us more confidence around our accountability of these changes, but even at this stage, we may wish to do something differently. So how is this different to a theory of change? The theory of change that we looked at a number of slides ago worked backwards. It said, what is the impact goal? What are the changes required for that impact goal to be realised? What are the outputs going further back? What are the activities and inputs and so on? Well, this approach is going the opposite way. We start from a position of stakeholders, we ask the stakeholder what changes for them, and we get a more holistic, a broader view of those changes, some of which are negative, some of which are positive, and this visualization could go on and become quite complex, dependent on the nature of the situation we're investigating. But it does provide a greater opportunity to understand holistic changes. It's, as identified earlier, when creating a theory of change, particularly if we're not involving stakeholders, it's quite unusual for the organisation to include unintended negative changes. If that's the case, our ability to manage them, i.e. reduce them, is much reduced. So there's a much greater risk that we will create negative impacts in the lives of some people. Doing this approach, a bottom-up approach involving stakeholders, reduces the risk that we simply are not aware or perhaps ignore unintentionally negative changes in the lives of people. Again, there is a standard available on the website, But when we start to think about some of the questions around, well, how many people do we involve? What's the sample size for qualitative research? There is no statistical test that will ever tell you the number of people that must be engaged with in a qualitative manner. But within each segment, for the highest levels of rigor, we go until we reach what's referred to as saturation point. By saturation point, essentially that means that we've spoken to enough people that we are hearing the same things. The conversation has become saturated. We're not hearing new things. Now, of course, there is always a risk that the next person will tell us something different, something new. There is no rule that says X percentage of people engaged with qualitatively can guarantee that we will not hear anything else. But what we are saying is the risk of doing so is mitigated, is managed, because our sample size, we've engaged with sufficient people to reach what we believe to be saturation point. We can never eliminate the possibility that the next person may tell us something else, just as we can never eliminate all of the different potential bias within stakeholder engagement. To limit or to reduce those risks, we try to use a sample size that is representative of those different segments. We ensure that we do engage with each segment. We should also think about who conducts that qualitative engagement, where that qualitative engagement is conducted, and the manner in which it is conducted. It may be that you make a decision as an organisation to hire an external consultant or researcher to undertake some of these activities. It may be that you do them yourselves, but you need to be very conscious of the different potential biases that exist. We cannot eliminate them, but we can manage them to a point that provides us with enough precision for the decision. And again, having addressed those questions, we now understand our problem, our solution, or solutions. We have a better understanding of those stakeholders that are involved. And we're now starting to get a better idea of what has changed for our stakeholders, the positives and negatives, of course. This may give us sufficient confidence to make a decision. Perhaps having looked at the employability example, where we can see that some people are depressed, as an organisation, you may say, we don't need to know how much of an impact we're creating in depression. One person becoming depressed is a bad thing, morally unacceptable for us as an organisation, therefore we will do something about it. If that's the case, you have enough confidence to make a decision, but again, you may want to understand the depth, the significance of the impact you're creating in terms of people becoming more depressed, as well as those people becoming more satisfied, before you make some of the decisions. In summary, it's the well-defined outcomes informed by our stakeholders as being reasonably sustainable and valuable that provide us as an organisation with a greater opportunity to increase and maximise impact, because we are focusing on those changes that people value. Qualitative engagement is absolutely essential to be able to do so. Quantitative creates the potential to miss some of the really, really important information. So we've addressed impact questions 1 through 4. This also provides us with some information about the final impact question, question 10, which asks which changes matter to those people affected and are those that are going to help us manage our impacts. We've been talking about this as we've gone through the different impact questions, asking ourselves the question about whether we have enough confidence to make some decisions at the moment. We are going to make judgments. What we've done to date is really identify relevant changes. And by relevant, through our qualitative engagement, we mean relevant to the stakeholder, relevant to our organisation, perhaps relevant to societal norms. That's the first screen or the first test of materiality. Materiality is essentially asking this question around impact question 10, around which changes matter most to people and which are important enough for us to build into our management and our decision making. So we may have identified a range of relevant outcomes, but we may also be able to make a judgment at this stage that says outcome A, that we heard from a very small number of people, is not relevant. Now that is a judgment we are going to make. Now transparency is the principle, insists that all of these judgments are explicitly discussed in any account and within the decision-making process. The risk, of course, of making a decision at this point to exclude an outcome is that we may not then understand that it is potentially significant, i.e. it is large enough, valuable enough to affect our decision-making process. It is principle number 7 around verification of the results that allows others, be they the stakeholders, be they independent external auditors and assurance organisations, that can help give us greater confidence in our judgments. The next webinar really goes into the detail around understanding the significance of different changes. This webinar has really focused on the relevance of different outcomes. Fundamental to all of this is that we believe, Social Value International believe that taking account of the social, environmental and financial outcomes, those effects that happen through our activities, we can make more informed decisions that improve the quality of people and reduce environmental harm and degradation. Thank you very much. Please do join us for the next webinar and have a look at the websites. Again, most of the information is freely available.